All right, so I would like to announce that we're going to have a really incredible event now. We're going to bring in the old space pioneers, actually. They are quite old now. They've been working on things from all the way from the beginning of the space industry until now with Dr. Greenhouse. And so I would like to see them all. There they are. There they are. The original space pioneers.
And Flora's up there too.
Yep, I think we've got Flora in there. So Flora, we're going to catch you afterwards with your broadcast. But right now we have David Cheuvront. We have, who's that? Let's see. We've got Denny. I have to come up here and look.
Denny Holt.
We've got Denny Holt. We've got David. Do you want to speak up and introduce the? Oh, there's Anita. Hi, Anita.
Howdy.
And I guess Xavier is our new gentleman. So maybe each one of you can just say a few brief words about yourself. I want to talk right now to the. That's amazing what I'm seeing right now. Okay. So I want to talk briefly to each of the original pioneers. I want you to tell me your favorite story about your experiences, and I'll let David decide who gets to go first. And then afterwards, we're going to go into this wonderful broadcast with Flora Dutra and Alison Renault and the Amazon tribes. Welcome. Go ahead, David.
Okay, well, maybe Denny, would you like to start off? You're muted.
Okay, yeah, I'll start. And I was one of the children of Apollo, and I'm 78 years old. So you have to have, if you take the long view, and in space it does pay to take the long view. I'll give you just a quick summary of what I put together. But in October the 4th, 1957, Sputnik launched, and I was 12 years old. In May the 5th, 1961, Alan Shepard was the first American in space, and I was 16 years old. And then President Kennedy, in September the 12th, 1962, committed the U.S. to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth within the decade. February the 20th, 1962, which is my 17th birthday, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. And in June the 12th, 1967, I reported to work at NASA's Manned Spacecraft Center, which is today the Johnson Spacecraft Center. And at that time, there was half of the world's experience in space operations. And the other half was behind the Iron Curtain in Russia. And what's interesting was when you talk to kids today in school, the concept of Iron Curtain is something they don't understand. In November the 9th, 1967, the first Saturn V launched. I'd been working for NASA for 5 months. It was 10 years after Sputnik's. I was 8 miles from the launch pad, and I was 22 years old. So in 10 years, we went from, in 12 years, we went from Sputnik to the first launch of the Saturn V rocket. And in 69, July the 20th, 1969, when Apollo 11 landed on the moon, fulfilling JFK's challenge, I was on the Apollo 11 flight control team. I was 24 years old, and I got married 2 weeks later. So in retrospect, the class of 1967, Tennessee Tech, and other colleges around the country, we won the lottery. They hired 500 of us that summer, at the at the Manned Spacecraft Center for the Apollo program, which was shortly after the fire. And I was fortunate enough to work on Apollo, Skylab, Shuttle Space Station, and a lot of the payloads like Hubble servicing and so forth. And I retired in 2001 after 34 years. Done some consulting since, but I have been blessed to have been a participant in human spaceflight operations and her human exploration. And I will give you this, and it's one of my favorite memories. Nobody ever said it better than Glenn Lunny, who was one of the original flight directors, was the youngest guy to come from the center at the Manned Spacecraft Center with Bob Gilruth and Chris Kraft. And Glenn became the flight director and shuttle program manager. And it's also my friend and personal idol. So his book, Highways in Space, when he autographed the book, he said, Denny, we were really brilliant to come along at this time in history. We had ringside seats for some of the big times in U.S. space history. And looking back, it's always the people who come to mind. And this book tries to capture some of it. And so technical competence has always been the real rule for how you get in space and what you can do when you get there. I was amazed at the JWST presentation. I've followed it quite a bit. I worked with the Hubble guys on servicing as the mission director before I retired, and I'm still in awe of the fact that they put that together, and they put it together autonomously in an area of space that was too far to go do anything to go rescue it. So that you go back long enough, and when I came to work, we still had dial telephones with a rotary dial on them. We were using fax machines to communicate with E-size drawings drawn on draftsman's tables. We had no electronics communication at all. We got on airplanes to go to the Cape. We got on the telephone to talk to people at the contractors. We used scamophones to have secure communications to the military sites that we used for around the world recovery. And on the Apollo 8, when I was in the recovery, my first job was in the recovery. We were Randy Stone and I, Randy became the deputy center director at the center, were in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean on a troop carrier, and we were the backup landing force for the Apollo 8 that went around the moon, the Christmas mission. You could have gotten back 12 hours early if you really needed to. And what we got for communications was teletype, and they told us that we got a message every 8 hours that pretty much said everything's nominal, all systems go. And we didn't know until we got to Rio de Janeiro and saw a picture of the moon, or saw the Earthrise picture. We had no clue what was really going on. So I think competent people, technical, who actually fought among each other unmercifully. There were fights that nearly broke out in conference rooms. And at the end of the day, everybody went off and said, okay, and let's go drink a beer. So it was a collegial type organization. Technical competence was what counted, and it will always be what counts if you want to do something like this. So education is going to be the most important thing, and experience. And it helps to have adult leadership, and we had that in spades.
That was
Dave's gonna get
wonderful.
somebody else.
Okay, well, Ken, I think your experience goes back at least that far, so why don't you go next?
Thank you, Denny.
He's much older than I am.
Oh, yeah. I'm an old young. Um, can you hear me? Everybody? Okay. Yeah, Danny and I actually played some pretty good basketball through the years. Back, it all wasn't all work, although 90% of it was. Anyway, he mentioned the people, of course, and I started, by the way, out of UT Austin, as an aerospace engineer in June of 1962. I think a good 5 years before Denny showed up. And I was a rendezvous trainee or learnee. There were only maybe 5 people in the world, including the Russians, that probably had a clue as to how to do orbital rendezvous. And luckily, I was in on the ground floor of that. But to not be too verbose, and I tend to be that. So, Dave, you cut me off if I get too long. But I thought Denny mentioned Glenn Lunny, who was a great guy and good friend, just like with really everybody he knew at Manned Spacecraft Center in Johnson. He told me a story. I'm going to use that to lead into the one story I'll tell about basically people and how great they were. And it involves 2 astronauts who you both all know, I'm sure, Neil Armstrong and Alan Bean. Glenn told me this story maybe, I don't know, 30 years after it happened at some reunion we had about Neil. Neil Armstrong was the coolest, the perfect person to be the first man to step on the moon. And I had never heard it, and I don't think Glenn told too many people this. By the way, I got catch 22. I'm sitting in sunlight. That's why I grew a white beard there. This is the hottest room in the house, but it's the only one my wife would let me show background of. And I could move to the other side, but my Wi-Fi doesn't reach that far. My router is not good over on the other side of the house. But anyway, Neil seems the story that I'm going to tell. Most people I don't think ever heard this, even we NASAites. Glenn told it to me back in, I don't know, 90 something. And I had a chance to talk to Neil about it 10 years after that, I think. Anyway, it involves his crash of the flying bedstead, the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle, LLRV. They called it the flying bedstead, out at Ellington Base, just a few miles from Manned Spacecraft Center at the time. And you all have probably seen it. The thing, he lost control, attitude control, and Neil had to bail out at about 200 feet altitude, which was really getting down to the minimum in which hopefully his parachute would open. Anyway, you can YouTube this or Google it, and you can see the crash of the LLRV on the runway. Big fireball. This was in May of '68, a good 14 months before he landed on the moon. And it was training exercise, of course. And that happened early in the morning when the breezes, Gulf breezes were down, so the vehicle was more stable, but this time it didn't work. Anyway, so Neil floats down off the runway, and the fire truck runs out. Rescue people pick him up, unhurt, holding up his parachute, and they take him back, and he just changes clothes to his office attire and goes back on to work at 8 or so o'clock in the morning. And of course, the word of the crash gets around the center by 7:30 or 8, whenever it happened, in a few minutes, because it's only 5 miles away. And Neil goes back to work in his office. Well, it turns out Glenn Lunny had a meeting coincidentally with Alan Bean, Neil's one roommate. There were two to an office back in those days in Building 4, the crew ops building. So he goes over at 1 o'clock to talk to Al Bean about a Apollo 12 issue. And of course, he had heard about the crash. So he walks in the office there, and there's Neil standing there with Alan and showing Alan something in a textbook, as Neil was wont to do. He went after his mission to Cincinnati, University of Cincinnati, and taught aeronautical engineering for years at Cincinnati. Anyway, he walks up to him and says to Neil, "Gee, Neil, that's quite a close call you had this morning, huh?" And Alan Bean looks at both of them and goes, "What are you talking about?" Neil had not even mentioned it to his roommate. Now that's cool enough, but that's the kind of guy Neil was. It was just business as usual. So maybe 10 years later at a reunion, Apollo, probably a 40th reunion, I go get the chance to go to kind of a special, the sun is right in, this is diabolical. I'm invited by Buzz Aldrin actually to meet him and Neil up in upstairs of the Space Center Houston for our 40th Apollo reunion. And I was talking to Neil about various things, but I brought up that story and I said, "Hey, Neil, Glenn told me a story that, I hadn't heard before, and I've never heard you mention it." And so I recounted it, and I said, "So is that right? You forgot or didn't bother to tell, Alan that you had the big crash that morning?" And he gives me that wry smile, kind of humble look that he had. I guess he was about 79 at the time. Oh, I wish I were 79 now. But anyway, he said, "I don't know. I guess it maybe happened like that. I don't remember." And so I go, "Well," and then he thinks for a minute, and he kind of brightens up, and he says, and then clouds up, and he says, "But the worst thing that happened that day?" And I go, "What could be worse than almost buying the farm right there a year before your mission?" And he says, "Well, I floated down off the runway into all that Paul Johnson grass, and be damned if I didn't get chiggers on both my legs. It took me 2 months to get rid of those damn." So this to me just personified what a cool guy Neil was, which everybody knew. And I got many a story along those ways about other really fine, brave astronauts, but I won't tell them now. So just want to repeat what Denny said, and it's always, if you learn one thing when you get to be an octogenary, it's the people that matter, and the people, hopefully, generally, are the greatest thing about being a human being. And from what I've heard today, I'm glad to hear there are young people still carrying on to us pioneers that we're damn proud. As Jerry Bostic, the flight controller, once proudly said, we were a proud bunch, and we were. We did some damn good things. But that's it for me. I could tell stories all night, but not with the sun in my face. So that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Ken.
Okay, well, I think next up ought to be Anita with some shuttle experience, perhaps, or whatever you want to talk about, Anita.
Thank you, David. I wrote a few notes. I have similar memories. Oh, by the way, I'm joining you from a hotel room in the DC area. I was at my home near Johnson Space Center in Houston yesterday morning and drove here. Actually, I'm currently the CEO of the National Space Society, and we're moving everything that NSS had in the Washington D.C. area. We're moving to our new office at Kennedy Space Center. So I'm doing a little cargo run with the chief operating officer. I'm meeting him at storage units, and so this is not my normal place to be, and I've been traveling for 2 days. Anyway, I had similar experiences to what Denny Holt expressed about remembering Sputnik and remembering Alan Shepard's first flight. Yuri Gagarin's flight didn't make much difference to me because it was the Soviet Union. We couldn't aspire to do anything with that. I was a few years later. I graduated with a bachelor's in 1973 and a master's in 1974. And anyone who graduated in 73 or 72 in engineering would remember that the job market in engineering was absolutely in the toilet. So at University of Washington in Seattle, they had and still have a one-year master's, no thesis requirement, no language requirement. I figured, it's like another senior year. It wasn't, but got through it. And in 1974, had 13 job offers without even trying. My experiences, though, were very different than anyone else here. And the word pioneer is appropriate. There were some trailblazing women in engineering, and I was privileged to know a few of them. Pioneers are the people who go out after the trailblazers and go out and do the sod busting and establishing settlements and all that kind of stuff. When I was in college, probably either in late my junior year or early in my senior year, engineering enrollment of women passed 1%, which means when I got into industry, the engineering population or engineering percentage of women was 0.00 For most of my career, and even this still happens to this day in retirement, I was first woman, only woman, most vintage woman of almost everything I ever did in my career. So there are a lot of stories which we don't need to get into here, but literally we were establishing what are the rules of behavior for when a guy and a gal are at a door, who opens it? And we just figured, well, whoever's there first. And it was a very, very different time for we women in engineering. It was fortunate for those of us who graduated between about 1972, 1976, somewhere in there. It was a transition period where the professors at universities were starting to figure out that women were in engineering because they really wanted to be engineers, whereas guys might go into engineering because mom thought it would be a good idea or dad was one. That the professors were figuring out that we women were, well, first of all, we had to get the really great grades or someone would come up to you and say, why don't you get out of engineering and make a spot for a guy to make something of it. I know that happened, but it was a very different time. I was very privileged when I graduated in 74 to be able to join the space shuttle program at Rockwell in Downey, California. Boeing ended up being operated by Boeing because they bought our division, and I think it was 1996 they bought our division. And most of my career worked in payload and cargo integration. So I was I was seeing everything that flew in the cargo bay of the space shuttle, and it was such a privilege and amazing. And because I was in payload and cargo integration, doing some process improvements and some proposals, I managed in my career to get to almost every place that a payload on the space shuttle would ever go. So I traveled around the country and crawled around on launch pads and did all kinds of really cool stuff. As far as stories are concerned, they're probably, I was a contractor. I was on the Rockwell side. I was not on the NASA side. And there are probably some stories that NASA folks really don't know about what it was like in Downey. Downey, California is in the middle of the Los Angeles basin. Most of the buildings were built during either during World War II, when there was a contractor there named Consolidated Vultee. You can still occasionally in an air museum find an aircraft called the Vultee Vibrator. It was a trainer during World War II. Those were built in Downey. And then some buildings were built for Apollo. And what a lot of folks don't know is that the facilities were actually pretty bad. The roof leaked. They'd repair the roof, and all that happened is the leak would move. When we had the Whittier Narrows earthquake, we literally had one building, Building 290, was just 3 walls kind of plastered against Building 6. Of course, they during the earthquake, they oscillated at different frequencies, so the roof was torn up in between them, and literally we had waterfalls going down in our offices. There were critters. Here we're making the most sophisticated vehicle in the world. We're doing the design, later the operations. The front end and the aft end of the space shuttle orbiters were built in Building 1 in Downey, and we had leaky roofs and we had rats. You know, we engineers, being curious critters we were, we had cubicles. And dust would settle on the tops of the cubicles, are about 5 feet high. And in the morning, you'd kind of look there and you see little rat footprints in the dust. So it's one of those places where the physical facilities were awful, but magic happened there. It was a place where magic happened, and we all knew it. And you just tolerated these weird conditions because we were working on magic on Space Shuttle, and it was really, really, really amazing. And for those of us who were in very tiny minorities, we women at the time, it was interesting to see how the industry changed. And now women are just engineers like everyone else. But back in those times, we had our battles, and it's not worth really recounting them now. But there was some road paving that had to be done to make the industry like it is today. Anyway, that's what I wanted to share. And thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here. And by the way, David and I volunteer in something called Space Settlement Design Competitions. We literally travel around the world and inspire kids. The Space Settlement Design Competition started in 1984, and every year we inspire thousands of kids around the world to pursue technical careers and get into engineering and technical disciplines. So, David, thank you for your volunteering.
You're welcome, Anita. And I guess since chronologically here, I kind of come in space station, I think maybe I should go next. My first introduction into the space area was growing up. My father was a Navy test pilot. He was a fighter pilot in World War II, carriers and so forth. He was at Pax River, Maryland, which is where I first remember anything, is living in a farmhouse with the runway right across from a row of trees and all the test flying going on there. And I remember Alan Bean was in the service test division with my dad at that time. I remember Alan coming over and talking with my brother, also an Alan, about his science fair project, coaching him, mentoring him, answering his questions about engineering versus the arts. And my brother said, Alan says, well, you can do both. Well, of course, Alan Bean went on to go to the moon as the pilot for the LEM for Apollo 12. He also had a history of producing some really wonderful art, paintings of the lunar surface. So that was very inspiring to me. My dad finally retired and taught me to fly. He was an instructor, so he had me get my pilot's license early on when I was even before high school, starting on that. So I got my pilot's. My computer has a little glitch here, so sorry about the pause there. But after getting my pilot's license, I decided to work on a mechanical engineering degree and started working in aircraft modification, engineering, overhaul, accident investigation, things like that. So I was doing that, and then I ended up in a technology conference, space technology, and met Cy Rubenstein from Rockwell Downey, where Anita had worked. And he said, "Why don't you come out to Downey? We've got a little problem here with the space station proposal. Our calculations show us that we're going to need a crew of 25 people to maintain the station if we design it like the shuttle was." And so I was tasked to go out and figure out how we could maintain the station with no more than a crew of about 8 and about two and a half crew allocated to maintenance. So that was how I got into the space side of things. That ended up leading me to working with McDonnell Douglas and being at Houston at McDonnell Douglas and with JSC. Ended up getting asked to come over to NASA, so I worked at NASA for a while. I was getting to meet all of these people from all over the world. It was great getting to work with all the different cultures. I was at one point lead for test and verification for the station elements and the international partner verification. So I traveled to see all these different places and meet with these different people. Russia, that was quite a thing because when I was growing up, that was the time of the Iron Curtain. It came down while I was there. I ended up going to Russia after that fall of the Iron Curtain and start of the Russian Federation. It was just really amazing getting to work with the people from these different cultures. I got to really see and appreciate the insights that people from other cultures brought into our program, from Russia, from Japan, from Canada. Really found that just to be amazing. Later on, I ended up working in advanced technology development and looking at how we could do the lunar Mars return programs. Met Peter Diamandis at Singularity University. He was talking about exponential growth of all these different fields, and I asked Peter, I said, "Well, you have any idea why it is we don't seem to be having exponential growth in space technology and launch capabilities?" And he didn't really have an answer, so that set me into looking into that, and I came up with some theories about that, and ended up presenting those at headquarters and being asked to be involved with some activities to try to help accelerate our progress in space. Came up with things like depot concepts for extending the amount of mass that you can get to any point, any place, the moon or whatever. Some of the stuff behind me was about that. Really started seeing the benefits of getting commercial space going and engaged with this. So that's what I've done since then, is try to work towards trying to get the growth of space launch and development to go from kind of slow linear to exponential. And of course, I'm worried about the debris problems and all that, like folks have mentioned earlier today. We've got to figure out solutions for that. Working with education, trying to get these students involved in things. So that's where I came in with this, working with Anita, and I'd also like to maybe hand it over to Xavier, if you would, please.
All right, thanks, David. my passion started when I was a kid. My father was working on his doctorates in Houston, and we would go to NASA quite often just because my parents knew how much I enjoyed space. But Anita spoke of a challenge, when coming in as a female in engineering back then. Well, my challenge back then was being put into a special ed program because I was a Hispanic student, and for no other reason. And here I am now talking about pioneering. Spaceport Mexico is now looking to start their own space program. And I've been asked to work along with them and some American engineers at the same time to help get that program up and moving. And, I went from that beginning to this now, which I kind of find quite incredible. The CEO from Spaceport approached me a couple of weeks ago, and this is before I got back from a trip with Anita. We were going down to Grand Canyon, and we got to talk about some of this. So had some intense days there, and talking about what Mexico wants to do to the point where they even rewrote their constitution so that they could get this going and actually pioneer the beginning of their space program. This has allowed me to also work with students from all over the world because of the SSDC, SSDT program that Anita has put together, and growing the passion in the students, in Latin America, who probably figured they would never have a chance at working with space or have anything to do with it. Now they're getting those opportunities because of this. And I get emails and calls quite often because they want to know what else they can do. They're still in school, and they want to know what's next for them because they want to ensure that they get to be part of this. This is going to be part of their future. And, these kids will be the future pioneers for what, is to come. And, this all came from a passion, and it all started a few years ago for me in a sense when Anita introduced me to David and said, hey, catch him up with this program. And I've been with it ever since, and I really appreciate that I've been brought into this family and got to work with a lot of, people in the aerospace program as well. Like I said, the students from all over the world. But my passion is to hopefully open this up to a greater part of the world and to let students know that they can have that future and to never give up on that passion that they've got. Maybe their country doesn't have it now, but it is something that can happen in the future. It's, what was it? I'm going to end it right here. It all started for me, like I said, a few years ago, and my father was days from passing away. And I get an email all of a sudden asking if I would apply into the Citizen Astronaut program, and that just kind of made me sit back, and I passed it on to my father, and it's a proud moment. Thank you all.
Thank you, Xavier. Robin, you want to read for us?
Robin?
Hello, thank you so much for that. It was wonderful to hear from all of the original space pioneers. Thank you, David Cheuvront, for putting that together for us. Really appreciated it. I wanted to say a few words about one of the missing original pioneers, Dr. David Youngman, who was very influential in my early career in high-definition television. He saw me by accident at an old NAB conference with my lamps and spent the whole day with me talking about the future of the space food growing program and what I could do with space and how important it was, what I was working on. He was very encouraging to me. And David Youngman is one of these incredible individuals that a lot of people don't know about, but he created the NASA Broadcasting Division, And the whole reason that NASA has NASA TV and NASA TV Plus was because of David Youngman. So he couldn't be with us tonight because he's had a tragic loss in his family. And I just wanted to say my condolences to David Youngman and to say I'm sorry you aren't here with us tonight, but you are in spirit, and I'm thinking of you, and we'll catch up with you at another time.